He had exactly 37 minutes to save his mother's legacy. 37 minutes to prove that 6 years of humiliation, a lifetime of prejudice, and the complete destruction of his dreams had all led to this moment. The Formula One engine lay in pieces before him like a $3 million corpse, while behind him cameras rolled and engineers laughed. "If you can fix this," the chief engineer had sneered, "I'll marry you myself." She didn't know he'd already solved it. She didn't know who he really was. She didn't know that the black cleaning man she'd mocked for weeks had once been called America's most promising young engineer before they destroyed him. When the whole world tells you to stay in your place, do you listen, or do you show them what you're made of? Marcus Williams moved through the gleaming halls of Hartley Racing headquarters like a shadow at midnight. His 6-foot frame seemed to shrink under the fluorescent lights that illuminated every imperfection in his faded coveralls. The uniform bore the ghostly outline of Williams Auto Repair, the letters barely visible after years of washing. He arrived each night at 11 sharp, when the last engineer's Tesla had long since left the parking lot. While other members of the cleaning crew gathered in the break room to share gossip and leftover donuts, Marcus plugged in his earbuds and lost himself in recorded MIT engineering lectures he'd downloaded from free course websites. His hands, dark and calloused from years of labor, moved with practiced efficiency as he mopped the pristine floors where million-dollar engines were born. But those who bothered to look closely might have noticed something unusual in the way he paused near each workstation. His fingers would hover just above the tools, tracing the shapes of components without touching them. His lips moved silently, calculating compression ratios and torque specifications like prayers to a mechanical god. During his 15-minute breaks, he would pull out a worn notebook and sketch engine modifications on napkins, always careful to fold them into his pocket before anyone could see. The studio apartment he returned to each morning sat above Kim's liquor store on 8 Mile Road, where police sirens provided a nightly symphony and the walls shook whenever the freight trains passed. 500 square feet that served as both home and shrine to abandoned dreams. Salvaged engine parts lined makeshift shelves constructed from milk crates and plywood. Technical manuals, their spines cracked from repeated reading, formed precarious towers beside his twin bed. The kitchenette counter disappeared beneath carefully labeled containers of bolts, sorted by size and thread pitch with obsessive precision. In the bottom drawer of a battered dresser, locked with a padlock he'd used since high school, lay 2 pieces of paper that mapped the trajectory of a life derailed. The first, an acceptance letter from MIT dated 6 years ago, the scholarship amount highlighted in yellow marker by a hand that had once trembled with joy. The second, from Caltech, offered similar promises of a future that would never materialize. Both letters remained pristine, as if keeping them perfect could somehow preserve the moment before everything changed. Tucked between them was a small Polaroid photograph, its edges soft from handling. The image showed a 12-year-old boy with bright eyes and a fresh haircut standing beside a rebuilt Chevrolet engine. His small hands gripped a first-place trophy from the National Youth Engineering Competition, while a woman with the same determined jawline stood behind him, her hand resting proudly on his shoulder. He wore her St. Christopher pendant now, the silver dulled with age but always warm against his skin. It had been her constant companion through double shifts at the Ford plant, where she'd worked the line with hands that later taught her son to see poetry in pistons and purpose in precision. Dorothy Williams had believed in 2 things above all else: the honesty of machines and the brilliance of her only child. The pendant was all he had left of her now, that and the muscle memory of 1,000 lessons learned in the garage that had been their kingdom. When he was 8 years old, Marcus Williams had wandered into his mother's garage and found his calling in the ordered chaos of tools and machinery. Dorothy Williams wasn't just a mechanic. She was an artist who happened to work in metal and motion. Her garage on the east side of Detroit had become legendary among those who knew where to find it. Factory workers brought her engines that certified mechanics had declared dead, and she resurrected them with a combination of technical knowledge and something that approached intuition. She'd worked at Ford's River Rouge plant for 20 years, maintaining the massive machines that built America's vehicles, and she approached every engine with the same life-or-death seriousness. "Listen here, baby boy," she would say, placing his small hand on a running engine block. "Feel that vibration? That's the heartbeat. Every engine's got one, and once you learn to feel it, you'll know when something's wrong before any computer can tell you." She taught him to read technical manuals before he'd finished elementary school, to calculate gear ratios before he'd learned algebra in class. By the time he turned 14, Popular Mechanics had featured him in an article titled Detroit's Teen Engineering Prodigy, focusing on his revolutionary redesign of a diesel engine that reduced emissions by 40% while increasing fuel efficiency. The article had caught the attention of university recruiters and summer program directors across the country. Scholarship offers arrived weekly, each one carefully filed in a folder Dorothy labeled "My Boy's Future" in her meticulous handwriting. He remembered the evening she'd sat at their kitchen table, reading each offer aloud while he worked on rebuilding a transmission in the garage. Her voice had carried through the open door, mixing with the smell of motor oil and the sound of Detroit's summer nights. MIT, Caltech, Georgia Tech, Carnegie Mellon, the names of institutions that had seemed as distant as stars suddenly felt within reach. Everything changed during his senior year of high school. The Morrison Engineering Summer Program selected only 40 students nationwide, and Marcus had been the youngest chosen. More significantly, he was the only black student in a program that prided itself on identifying future industry leaders. The 8-week intensive at their suburban campus had started with promise. His roommate, a prep school kid from Connecticut named Brad, had marveled at Marcus's ability to diagnose engine problems by sound alone. The instructors had nodded approvingly at his questions during lectures. Then came the Combustion Engine Design Challenge in week 6. Each student was tasked with creating a prototype that maximized efficiency while minimizing environmental impact. Marcus had worked 18-hour days, applying principles he'd learned in his mother's garage combined with cutting-edge theory from the program. His design incorporated a revolutionary valve timing system that he'd been conceptualizing since he was 15. When testing day arrived, his prototype had outperformed not only every student design, but also the baseline model created by the instructors. Dr. Patricia Morrison herself, the program's founder and a legend in automotive engineering, had examined his work with increasing agitation. "This is impossible," she'd declared, holding up his technical drawings. "These calculations require graduate-level mathematics. Where did you copy this from?" The accusation had hung in the air like poison gas. Marcus had stood frozen, his mother's words about dignity echoing in his mind as he tried to explain his process. But Morrison had already made up her mind. Despite his roommate's testimony about the long nights spent working, despite the notebooks filled with iterations and calculations, the verdict was swift and merciless. The program expelled him for academic dishonesty. The accusation letter, signed by Morrison and the board of directors, was sent to every university that had offered him scholarships. One by one, the offers were rescinded with form letters that expressed regret about recent revelations regarding academic integrity. MIT's withdrawal had arrived on a Tuesday. Caltech's came Thursday. By the following Monday, his future had evaporated like morning dew under a harsh sun. Dorothy Williams had transformed from a gentle giant into an avenging angel. She'd driven to the Morrison compound, demanded meetings, compiled evidence. She'd photographed Marcus's notebooks, created timelines, gathered statements from customers who'd witnessed her son's gifts since childhood. For 3 months, she'd fought with the determination of a woman who knew her son's life was at stake. She'd written letters to engineering departments, to newspapers, to anyone who would listen. The garage had suffered as she spent more time fighting than working, but she'd told Marcus that some things mattered more than money. The heart attack had taken her on a cold December morning, 3 days before Christmas. Marcus had found her in the garage, slumped over her desk where she'd been writing yet another appeal letter. The pen was still in her hand, the paper beneath her detailing the timeline of his work on the combustion engine. The paramedics said she'd been gone for hours, but Marcus had sat with her until they forced him to let go, whispering apologies for the dreams he'd cost her. The funeral had drained the last of their savings. The garage, already struggling, couldn't survive without Dorothy. Marcus had sold it to a developer who'd promised to preserve the Williams name, then watched as they tore it down to build a cell phone store. He'd kept only her tools, the ones she'd inherited from her father, and the St. Christopher pendant she'd worn every day since before he was born. MIT had called 2 weeks after the funeral, a sympathetic administrator suggesting he could reapply in a year when things had settled. Marcus had hung up without responding. Night shift cleaning jobs didn't require references or explanations about gaps in education. They didn't ask why a 22-year-old with perfect SAT scores was pushing a mop instead of pursuing a degree. Marcus had found a strange peace in the invisibility, in the way people's eyes slid past him as if he were furniture. He could be near engines without the weight of expectations or the risk of recognition. For 6 years, he'd perfected the art of being unseen, until last week when fate had laughed at his carefully constructed walls. He'd been cleaning the executive conference room when he'd heard the shouting from the engineering floor. Brittany Morrison III, daughter of the woman who destroyed his future, had inherited both her mother's company position and her temperament. Through the glass walls, he'd watched her berate her team over a blown Formula One engine that had arrived that morning. 6 days until the Indianapolis exhibition, she'd roared. 6 days to fix this, or we lose the biggest contract in Hartley's history. What am I paying you MIT graduates for if you can't solve a simple mechanical failure? Marcus had pressed himself against the wall, invisible in his cleaner's uniform, but his eyes had found the engine across the room. Even from that distance, he could see the telltale signs of harmonic imbalance in how the components sat. His fingers had twitched with the muscle memory of solutions, his mind automatically calculating the precise adjustments needed. He'd bitten his lip hard enough to taste blood, forcing himself to look away, to remember his place. But the engine had called to him like a siren song, and he'd known with terrible certainty that his 6 years of hiding were about to end. The following days at Hartley Racing had grown increasingly tense as Morrison's team failed to diagnose the engine's problem. Marcus had arrived each night to find new evidence of their frustration. Whiteboards covered in calculations that missed the mark, diagnostic printouts scattered like confetti, the sharp smell of burnt coffee from engineers pulling all-nighters. He'd cleaned around them silently, his trained eye catching every mistake, every wrong assumption. On Tuesday night, he'd found a junior engineer named Taylor Brennan slumped at her desk, surrounded by technical manuals. Without thinking, he'd adjusted the diagram she'd been working on, adding a single line that corrected her approach. He'd erased it moments later, heart pounding, but the gesture had awakened something he'd buried. Margaret Chen, the night cleaning supervisor, had noticed Marcus's distraction and pounced on it like a cat on a wounded bird. Chen had worked at Hartley for 15 years, climbing from cleaner to supervisor through a combination of efficiency and cruelty. She assigned Marcus the worst areas as punishment for what she called daydreaming on the job. The chemical storage room with its harsh fumes, the grease trap in the underground parking garage, the waste disposal area where failed components were thrown like mechanical corpses. Some people, Chen had said loudly enough for others to hear, just aren't meant to rise above their station. Best they learn that early. The junior engineers had been worse in their casual cruelty. On Wednesday morning, Marcus had been refilling supplies when he'd accidentally bumped into Taylor Brennan, the same engineer whose diagram he'd secretly corrected. His armload of paper towels had scattered across the floor, and he'd dropped to his knees to collect them. Brennan had stepped back with exaggerated disgust, examining her Italian leather shoes for contamination. "Watch where you're going," she'd snapped. "Do you have any idea how much these cost? More than you make in a month." Her colleague, Amanda Pearson, had laughed from her workstation. "Probably can't even read the warning signs on the equipment. That's why they're restricted to cleaning, Taylor." Thursday had brought a new level of humiliation when Dr. Patricia Hawthorne, Hartley's lead design engineer and sister to the woman who'd destroyed his mother, had caught Marcus looking at technical drawings left on a conference table. The blueprints had detailed the F1 engine specifications, and Marcus hadn't been able to resist tracing the fuel injection system with his eyes, immediately spotting 3 design flaws that would cause cavitation at high speeds. Hawthorne had snatched the papers away with theatrical alarm. "Security risk," she'd announced to the room. "These people shouldn't have access to sensitive areas. What if he's taking photos to sell to competitors?" The accusation had stung more than any physical blow could have. Hawthorne had immediately called Chen, demanding that Marcus be reassigned to bathrooms only. "We can't have industrial espionage from unexpected sources," she'd said, her eyes sliding over Marcus as if cataloging all the ways he didn't belong. But Friday had delivered the killing blow. Morrison had arranged a facility tour for potential investors, 3 women in suits that cost more than most people's cars. She'd guided them through the engineering floor like a proud parent, gesturing at the state-of-the-art equipment and her team of the finest minds from the best universities. As they'd passed the area where Marcus was mopping, Morrison had stopped, a thought occurring to her. "Ladies," she'd said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "I want you to see our commitment to the local community. We employ Detroit residents from all backgrounds." She gestured at Marcus without looking at him directly. Even those without education can contribute in their own small way. It's part of our diversity initiative. The investors had nodded approvingly, one murmuring about tax benefits for local hiring. Marcus had kept his eyes on the floor, his knuckles white around the mop handle, as they discussed him like he wasn't there. One investor had asked about the failed engine, and Morrison's smile had cracked slightly. "A minor setback," she'd assured them. "My team will have it running by Monday." As they'd walked away, Marcus had heard Morrison mutter to her assistant about useless degrees and overpriced education. The irony had burned like acid in his throat. That afternoon, the crisis had reached its peak. Morrison had called an all-hands meeting, her face flushed with anger and what might have been fear. The engine remained stubbornly broken despite every diagnostic tool and theoretical approach. She'd paced in front of her assembled engineers like a general before a failing army. "MIT's finest," she'd spat, "Caltech's brightest. Combined salaries that could fund a small country, and you can't fix one engine? My mother built this company's reputation on excellence, and you're about to destroy it with incompetence." Marcus had been cleaning nearby, invisible as always, when he'd heard Morrison outline the problem. Each word had confirmed what he'd suspected from his distant observations. The harmonic imbalance was causing a cascade failure, complicated by aftermarket modifications that created unexpected resonance patterns. The solution had formed in his mind with crystalline clarity. Adjust the valve timing by 7 degrees, compensate for the mixed components' different thermal expansion rates, and recalibrate the fuel injection sequence to match the new harmonic frequency. Without thinking, he'd whispered the calculation under his breath, the numbers flowing like a forgotten language suddenly remembered. Morrison had heard him. The entire room had seemed to freeze as she'd turned slowly, her eyes finding him for the first time in the week he'd been cleaning her floors. "What did you say?" The question had carried the weight of accusation and disbelief. Marcus had straightened, his hand finding the St. Christopher pendant through his coveralls. The moment stretched between them, heavy with possibility and danger. He could apologize, claim he'd said nothing, retreat into invisibility. Or he could speak the truth that had been burning in his throat for 6 years. "I said your approach is wrong," he'd heard himself say, his voice steady despite the trembling in his legs. "You're treating the symptoms, not the cause." The room had erupted in laughter, but Morrison had raised a hand for silence, her eyes narrowing as she studied him. Recognition had dawned slowly, and her smile had turned predatory. "Williams," she'd read from his name tag. "Williams, I know that name." Her voice had grown theatrical, playing to her audience. "Your mother was that mechanic who claimed her son was some kind of genius. Before we exposed the fraud." The words had hit Marcus like physical blows, but he'd remained standing, his mother's pendant warm against his racing heart. Morrison had circled him like a shark scenting blood. "The cleaning man thinks he knows engines," she'd announced to the room. "Tell me, Mr. Williams, where did you get your engineering degree? YouTube University?" The laughter had been louder this time, cruel and dismissive. Someone had pulled out a phone, starting to record. "I'll tell you what," Morrison had continued, her voice dripping with false generosity. "Since you think you can do better than my team of actual engineers, let's make this interesting." She gestured grandly at the dismantled engine. "If you can fix this engine, just get it running. I'll marry you myself. Hell, I'll make you lead engineer." The room had exploded with laughter and catcalls. Engineers had pulled out phones to record what they assumed would be spectacular humiliation. "But when you fail," Morrison had added, her voice turning cold, "you resign immediately and never work in any automotive facility again. You'll sign a statement admitting you're not qualified to so much as look at an engine. Deal?" The challenge had hung in the air like a guillotine blade, waiting to fall. Marcus had felt the weight of every eye in the room, the pressure of 6 years of silence and swallowed pride. His hands had begun to shake, and for a moment he'd wanted nothing more than to run. To flee this building and never return, to hide in his apartment among the salvaged parts and broken dreams. But then he'd heard his mother's voice, clear as if she stood beside him. "Baby boy, dignity isn't in what they call you. It's in what you know you are." He'd thought of her letters, still sitting in the desk where she died writing them. Of the garage that bore their name now buried under a cell phone store. Of every night he'd clean these floors while solutions danced in his head, erased before dawn like guilty secrets. "Deal," he'd said, and the single word had seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Morrison's grin had widened, sensing easy victory. "You have 1 hour," she'd said generously. Marcus had looked at the engine, then back at her. "I'll need 37 minutes," he'd replied. "One for each year of my mother's career you tried to destroy." The specific number had wiped the smile from Morrison's face, but she'd nodded curtly. Someone had started a live stream titled, "Watch This Janitor Fail," and within minutes, the viewer count had climbed into the hundreds. Marcus had set down his mop with deliberate care, then walked to the engine with the measured steps of someone approaching an altar. The crowd of engineers had parted mockingly, some bowing with exaggerated courtesy. He'd ignored them all, his focus narrowing to the mechanical puzzle before him. His hands had trembled as he'd picked up the first tool, but the moment the metal touched his palm, muscle memory had taken over. This was home. This was truth. This was everything they'd tried to take from him, preserved in the knowledge his mother had passed down like DNA. He'd circled the engine first, not touching, just observing. The spectators had mocked his careful examination. "Probably doesn't even know which end is up," someone had whispered. "Taking his time because he's scared," another had added. But Taylor Brennan, the engineer whose diagram he'd secretly corrected, had noticed something others missed. His lips had been moving silently, calculating compression ratios and thermal coefficients with the speed of a computer. Her laughter had died as she'd recognized the numbers he was processing. When he'd finally spoken, his voice had carried the authority of absolute certainty. Harmonic imbalance in the primary combustion chamber caused by a 0.3 millimeter deviation in the camshaft timing. He'd pointed without touching, his finger tracing the air above each component, compounded by improper fuel injection sequencing. Someone manually adjusted it, probably trying to compensate for the vibration, but they ignored the resonance frequency. Third issue, microfractures in the titanium valve springs, invisible to standard inspection but detectable through sound. To demonstrate, he'd picked up a wrench and tapped each spring in sequence. Different tones had rung out, creating a discordant melody. Hear that? B flat, where it should be C sharp. Your entire engineering team missed it because they relied on computer diagnostics instead of actually listening to the engine. The room had grown quieter with each word, the mocking smiles fading as engineers recognized the depth of his analysis. "Doctor." Hawthorne had pulled up diagnostic reports on her tablet, her face paling as she'd confirmed each observation. Marcus had begun the reassembly with movements that seemed choreographed, each gesture flowing into the next with economical grace. Parts that had taken the team hours to remove had slid into place at his touch, as if recognizing their master. Morrison had interrupted when he'd deviated from standard procedure. "That's not the assembly order specified in the manual," she'd said, trying to regain control. Without looking up, Marcus had replied, "Standard assumes standard conditions. This engine's been modified with aftermarket components your team didn't account for. Swiss precision bearings mixed with Japanese fuel injectors. Different thermal expansion rates. You need reversed assembly to create proper clearances." 20 minutes in, he'd encountered a component that made him pause. He'd studied it from multiple angles, his fingers hovering above the metal. "This part's been machined incorrectly," he'd announced. 7-degree angle instead of 9. No wonder you couldn't fix it. The entire system's fighting against itself. Morrison had objected immediately. "That's a $50,000 component, custom made in Germany." Marcus had picked up a hand file, hefting it with familiar weight. "Then you paid $49,999 too much." What had happened next had made several engineers gasp aloud. In 90 seconds of precise movements, he'd reshaped the component freehand, filing away metal with the confidence of a sculptor, revealing the form hidden in marble. An engineer had produced digital calipers, measuring his work. "Perfect 9-degree angle," she'd whispered. "That's impossible without CNC equipment." "Doctor." Hawthorne had moved closer, her hostility replaced by professional fascination. "How did you know the exact amount to remove?" Marcus hadn't answered, focused on the final assembly. With 5 minutes remaining, the engine had stood complete. Marcus had added oil with ceremonial precision, checking levels and connections with the thoroughness his mother had taught him. He'd stepped back, wiping his hands on a clean rag he'd produced from his pocket. The room had held its breath as Morrison had approached the ignition. Her hand had hovered over the button, hesitation clear in every line of her body. "Scared?" Marcus had asked quietly, and something in his tone had made her flinch. The engine had roared to life with a sound like symphony, not just running but purring with a perfection the original manufacturers had never achieved. The livestream chat had exploded with comments from engineers worldwide, many noting that the harmonic frequency was now perfect, the power curve optimal. The viewer count had passed 50,000 and kept climbing. Morrison had let it run for a full minute before killing the switch, the silence that followed absolute and devastating. 37 minutes exactly. The cleaning man with the mop had just outperformed a team of engineers with advanced degrees and decades of combined experience. Someone had dropped a coffee cup in the silence. It had shattered on the pristine floor, brown liquid spreading like blood. No one had moved to clean it. They'd all stood frozen, staring at Marcus as if seeing him for the first time. The Saint 12. Christopher Pendant had caught the light as he'd turned to face Morrison, and in that moment, he'd looked less like a cleaner and more like an avenging angel. Marcus had walked slowly toward the exit, each step measured and deliberate. The crowd of engineers had parted before him like the Red Sea, their mockery transformed into something between awe and shame. Morrison had stood frozen by the engine, her face cycling through emotions like a slot machine seeking a winning combination. Behind him, he'd heard the whispers starting, the questions about who he really was, how he'd learned to work such mechanical magic. Someone had already pulled up the old Popular Mechanics article on their phone, passing it around with growing excitement. His hand had just touched the door handle when Morrison's voice had cut through the murmur. Wait. The single word had carried the weight of 6 years, of his mother's death, of dreams deferred and dignity maintained. Marcus had paused but hadn't turned around. He'd stood perfectly still, letting her come to him, letting her cross the distance between their worlds. The clicking of her expensive shoes on the polished floor had sounded like a countdown to something inevitable. "The deal," she'd said when she'd reached him. "I meant what I said. The lead engineer position is yours. The salary." She'd named a figure that would have seemed impossible just an hour ago. Full benefits, company car, signing bonus. You'd have your own team, your own projects. Everything you should have had 6 years ago. Her voice had carried a note he'd never expected to hear from a Morrison. Respect, perhaps even something approaching remorse. Marcus had turned slowly, meeting her eyes directly for the second time that day. Around them, the engineering floor had remained frozen in tableau, everyone waiting for his response. The live stream continued rolling, viewer count approaching 100,000, comments flooding in from around the world. Job offers had already started arriving in Hartley Racing's public inbox, companies eager to claim the man who'd made the impossible look effortless. "Your mother," he'd said quietly, but his voice had carried to every corner of the room. "She destroyed my mother's reputation, killed her dreams, and 3 months later, killed her." Morrison had flinched at each word, the truth hitting harder than any physical blow. "My mother died writing letters to clear my name. Died believing that somewhere, somehow, justice existed for people like us." He'd touched the St. Christopher pendant, drawing strength from its familiar weight. "You want to make this right? Then you'll call her. Right now. And tell her what you saw today." Morrison's hand had moved to her phone automatically, then hesitated. "She's in a board meeting. The quarterly review." Marcus had waited, saying nothing, his silence more damning than any accusation. After a long moment, Morrison had dialed, her fingers unsteady on the screen. The room had remained silent enough to hear the phone ring, to hear the older Morrison's irritated voice answer. "Mom, I need to tell you something. About the Williams family, about what we did." The confession had poured out, witnessed by dozens of employees and thousands of online viewers. As Morrison had spoken, a young man had approached Marcus hesitantly. Mario Santos, an intern from Southwest Detroit, barely out of community college. "I'm from the same neighborhood," he'd whispered. "They told me I'd only ever be good for data entry. That people like us don't have the minds for real engineering. But watching you," his voice had broken with emotion. "Could you teach me, please? I'll come early, stay late, whatever it takes." Marcus had studied the young man's eager face, seeing his own younger self in those desperate eyes. The anger he'd carried for 6 years had shifted, transforming into something more powerful, purpose. "Saturday mornings," he'd said finally. "Bring coveralls, and be prepared to get dirty." Mario's smile had been like sunrise after a long, dark night. Morrison had ended her call, her face pale but somehow lighter. "She wants to meet with you, to apologize in person, to discuss compensation for." She gestured helplessly at the years that couldn't be returned. "The lead engineer position stands." Actually, she's authorized me to offer you Chief Technical Officer. You'd oversee all engineering departments. The offer had hung in the air like a golden apple, tempting and perfect. Marcus had looked around the pristine facility, at the state-of-the-art equipment and the engineers who'd mocked him an hour ago. He'd thought of his apartment above the liquor store, of the salvaged parts that lined his walls like trophies of a war fought in silence, of his mother's tools, waiting patiently in boxes for hands that understood their purpose. The choice had crystallized with perfect clarity. "I'll consult," he'd said finally. "Help you solve problems your team can't handle. But I'm reopening Williams Auto Repair." The name had tasted like honey on his tongue. Detroit needs engineers who look like the people they serve, who understand that brilliance doesn't always come with degrees. He'd glanced at Mario, who'd been hanging on every word, and who know that sometimes the best teachers are the ones who've been told they'll never be good enough. Morrison had nodded slowly, understanding more than he'd expected. "The marriage proposal," she'd said with a self-deprecating smile. "I suppose that's off the table?" For the first time in 6 years, Marcus had allowed himself to smile genuinely. "Miss Morrison," he'd replied with gentle pity, "you couldn't handle the maintenance." The joke had broken the remaining tension, drawing surprised laughter from the crowd. He'd walked out then, not in defeat but in victory. The live stream had captured it all. The man in coveralls walking tall through the sliding doors, while behind him, some of the world's most educated engineers stood in humbled silence. The viewer count had passed 200,000, and the comments section had become a testament to every person who'd ever been underestimated, overlooked, or dismissed. 6 months later, Williams Auto Repair had reopened in a new location, the sign gleaming under Detroit's summer sun. Williams & Sons, where engines don't see color. The shop had become more than a business. It had transformed into a movement. Young men from the neighborhood had lined up for the free training program, eager to learn from the man who'd made Forbes's 30 under 30 list and turned down offers from Ferrari and Tesla. The garage had maintained the spirit of the original, with one significant addition. In the corner, protected by glass, sat the Formula One engine he'd fixed that day, donated by Hartley Racing with a plaque that read, "Fixed in 37 minutes by Marcus Williams." Proof that brilliance has no color, no gender, and no limits. Tour groups of engineering students had visited regularly, and Marcus had welcomed them all, teaching them to listen to engines and trust their instincts. Morrison had sent her own son to learn, the boy arriving in designer jeans that had quickly been replaced with practical coveralls. "My mom says you're the best engineer she's ever seen," he'd said on his first day. "She also says she's sorry. Not just for what happened, but for taking so long to see." Marcus had accepted the apology in the spirit it was offered, then put the boy to work learning the fundamentals that no university could teach. The viral video had spawned 1,000 think pieces about talent and prejudice, about the barriers that kept brilliance from flourishing. But Marcus had avoided most of the media attention, preferring to focus on the work. He'd established a scholarship fund in his mother's name, ensuring that young people from Detroit would have the chances he'd been denied. MIT had offered him an honorary doctorate, which he'd accepted on behalf of his mother's memory. On quiet nights, when the last student had left and the garage had settled into familiar silence, Marcus would sometimes stand among the tools and breathe in the smell of motor oil and possibility. The St. Christopher pendant would catch the light as he moved, and he'd hear his mother's voice in the hum of machinery. "Baby boy, dignity isn't in what they call you, it's in what you know you are." The shop's success had proven that sometimes the best revenge wasn't revenge at all. It was living well, teaching others, and showing the world that talent could bloom in the most unexpected places. Every engine that left Williams & Sons ran with the smooth precision of justice served. Every young man who learned to trust his hands over others' words became a testament to resilience. In a world quick to judge and slow to apologize, Marcus Williams had chosen a different path. He'd chosen to build rather than tear down, to lift rather than crush, to teach rather than punish. The story had never been about fixing an engine in 37 minutes. It had been about fixing a broken system, one student at a time, one chance at a time, one dream at a time. In his mother's honor, he'd turned humiliation into humanity, prejudice into purpose, and silence into symphony. The man they'd tried to erase had become impossible to ignore, not through anger or vengeance, but through the simple act of being too excellent to deny. Some battles aren't won with power or connections or the right last name. They're won with steady hands and patient hearts, with knowledge passed down through generations and strength drawn from struggle. They're won by those who refuse to let others' limitations become their own, who know that dignity isn't granted by degrees or titles, but earned through dedication and maintained through grace. In a world that often mistakes volume for value and credentials for capability, Marcus Williams had proven that the quietest voice in the room might just be the one worth hearing. If you were him, standing in that moment of triumph with every door suddenly open, would you have chosen forgiveness? Would you have walked away from the golden cage of corporate success to build something greater? Or would the sweet taste of victory at the highest levels have been too tempting to resist? What excellence are we overlooking in our rush to judge by appearance? What brilliance are we burying under our assumptions about who belongs where? Perhaps the answer lies not in the extraordinary moments, but in the ordinary ones, in who we choose to see, to hear, to believe. Perhaps it lies in remembering that greatness often comes dressed in coveralls, that wisdom speaks in the language of experience, and that the most profound truths are written not in textbooks but in the calluses of working hands. In the end, Marcus Williams didn't just fix an engine. He fixed a small piece of a broken world, one spark plug at a time.